want to acknowledge that this exhibit was funded by a small grant from the Maynard Cultural Council, and we're grateful for that. I thank everyone for coming. My name is Lee Karras. I organized this exhibit along with Kate Wheeler, and we're very glad to have you watching this. This is the exhibit of Maynard's public shade trees. It's composed of old-time photos of how Maynard used to be and photos from today that show the differences, both for the good and for the bad. We're starting with two photos these are bird's eye views, and they're from the 1920s, and they're looking just at different parts of the town and showing that a great part of the woods had been cleared for pasture land, and then of course the mill came along as well. In the picture with the mill, you can see that there are trees in the town, but there's not really a lot of what you would call public shade trees. It's just the trees that were there that didn't have to be cleared for people to do what they needed to do. The rest of the exhibit is organized by street, and the first street we have is Main Street. And this photo of one of the major churches on Main Street shows that over time people do plant different trees on their property, and in this case it's gone from pines and firs, and then no trees directly in front of the church, but there are street trees that are not in the greatest of shape. I think they're probably Norway maples, which is what most street trees in Maynard are today. Then we have a view looking down Main Street when the trolley car was still there, and this part of the town is very bare of trees. There are trees in front of a residence here and farther down the way, but trees were not something that people really focused on in the commercial district of town, and this is the year 1912. Efforts have been made to make the area more inviting, planting trees in these very small plots. This was the picture 4 years ago in the fall, and today this corner that had trees just 4 years ago is now bare, and the trees are suffering and having a much harder time existing. Probably the wrong kinds of trees were planted in these areas. There are much more viable street trees than we currently have on Main Street at Walnut. This picture is from an old postcard when Maynard still had train service and a little depot building. The main mill is to the left and tenement housing to the right. The tracks have been removed. This is right before the rail trail project was started along the tracks, and there were street trees here, most of them again probably Norway maples, but in the fall there was lovely color, and the housing on this side also had a very nice buffer from the road, which is now gone with the new rail trail. And small trees have been planted, but it's going to be a very long time before the people who live over here have any degree of privacy again, and it's hoped that in the future more trees could be planted in this area. It really looks quite bare at this point in time. Then another core street in town is Nason Street. This is also an old-time photo postcard with the mill in the background and the commercial area. Not a single tree in sight. Again, it wasn't necessarily what people really paid much attention to or cared about in front of businesses. And there seems to be a paved sidewalk. I'm not sure what it was made out of, but it really didn't provide for planting spaces. 4 years ago, the area looked quite nice. the trees aren't large, but they add such a lovely element of greenery. And again, now, this is 4 years ago, just a couple of weeks ago, this photo was taken, and there are empty squares where the trees were, and an effort at replanting will be done as soon as the water ban is over in Maynard. I want to acknowledge that this exhibit was funded by a small grant from the Maynard Cultural Council, and we're grateful for that. Now we're on Summer Street, and these two photographs, this one from the Historical Society collection, and this one, this past Memorial Day, of Memorial Park. This was the dedication in 1925, and there are a few little shrubs around, but today the park is much greener and much more inviting. It is going to be redesigned, but I think trees will be a major part of that project. And this is a series of 4 photos of what is now Art Space Maynard and the Acme Theater, once the junior high school in Maynard. When it was erected, there were some trees on the street, and plantings were done of evergreens. And this is actually a photo from the 1960s, an Arbor Day planting in front of the building. And unfortunately, we've determined that the tree that was planted that year was a Norway maple, and it still stands outside of the building. On Summer Street here, this is a photo from the 1920s, a winter scene, and there are many public shade trees here, but today even more so. And it really does make a difference. In the sunlight, the play of light and shadow on the trees is interesting to look at. The different silhouettes, shapes of the trees in the winter are very clear at this point. Trees add liveliness and color, as well as being very beneficial along the road. These are 2 photos. It is the same building. It's the original schoolhouse that many of the early families in Maynard attended. This is a photo from the 1920s. It's much older than that, but you can see that it was a building that had a particular purpose, which today it doesn't have. It's a residence, and people have planted trees around it, and it looks much, much more inviting and part of its natural setting. Now we're on Summer Hill, and this photo from 1920 in the winter shows that there was pasture land and a stone wall partway up the hill, totally bare, and today no more cows, and it's conservation land, and you can still make out the crest of the hill, but it's a completely wooded area and enjoyed by people rather than cows at this point. I included these photos because I wanted to show that from time to time major efforts have had to be made to clean up areas in town. This is an old postcard of the Ben Smith Bridge, which is Route 117 in Maynard near the dam. And you can see even in 1906 there was a lot of growth around it, and eventually in the 70s a major project had to be done to clear the shoreline. Here we are on Parker Street, and this is Glenwood Cemetery, the one property in town that is on the National Register. And I love this old photograph of the entrance to the cemetery with the two women standing in front of it. In the Maynard history, it's one of the books says that women of the town were the ones who were responsible for the plantings around the center circle of the entrance and for having the gazebo made and also a well so that various plantings could be watered. Unfortunately, all that came crashing down in the hurricane of '38. In Maynard, there were almost 500 trees that were lost in the hurricane, not only in the cemetery, but in front of homes and along the roadsides. Nobody died in the hurricane in Maynard, but it had a devastating effect. And this is the entrance to Glenwood Cemetery today. That front circle that the women were standing in front of here is at this point completely bare. And it really does change the look of the place. And I personally find the old view much more inviting than the current one. There's certainly interesting work that could be done to make that more hospitable. And finally, I put Old Marlborough Road and the entrance to the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge in here, although these are not exactly public shade trees, land that was taken by the government in World War II. Homesteads were taken, and now it's a wonderful area that is not only a refuge for wildlife, but inviting with its paths and its shady glens. And it is absolutely a wonderful treasure that Maynard shares with several other towns. And then, last but not least, we have photos of trees done by the middle school students who are part of the photography club, sponsored here by the library and directed by the children's librarian, Mark Malcolm. And I think it's really, really important that the children in town have their sense of trees, their awareness of trees heightened as part of this project that we're going to be working on to improve Maynard's public shade trees.
I'd love to introduce the three young people who helped with the exhibit. One set of photographs is not yet up. Those are the photos of Ava Palazzolo? Palazzolo. Yeah, I should know. Who's age 11, and I have her photographs here. They will be joining the exhibit shortly. Thank you, Ava, and I'm sorry we didn't get them up in time, but soon. And Madison and Natalie Morgan are in the back. Will you come up just for a second, please? And their photos are in the back. You'll see them in the exhibit. And yes, they are related. Come on up and just say, thank you so much for participating.
I'd like to introduce Neil Peterson, Maynard resident, forest ecologist at the Harvard University Forest in Petersham. And you're writing a book, and you're going to tell us a little bit about it.
So thank you. It's nice to be here. I want to introduce myself a little bit. Kate and Lee asked me to talk about, since I'm a Maynardian. I used to go Maynarder, but we've been here for 3 years, and it's been really nice so far. And so they asked me to talk about a little bit about the book I'm starting to write about. It's entitled, the working title is The Memory of Trees. And so what I do is I work with tree rings to learn about history, whether it's the history of the tree, the history of the forest, or the history of climate, and the interactions between all those elements. And but before I talk a little bit more about that, please sit. I want to know what you think about trees when you think about a tree. You're tree huggers. I was just told you're tree huggers. So, what do you think about trees when you think about a tree? What do you like about trees?
Well, I'll start.
Thank you.
We were in the Adirondacks last week, and when we drove up there, the smell of the balsam and the pine, and it's almost like your lungs expand, and it's got to be the trees.
Oh yeah.
And it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. So a really pleasant, wonderful environment. What else? Yes.
Just shade. I mean, I'm working in my yard and in the sun, it's hot. I'm happy to be under a tree shaded. It's just a lot cooler under the tree.
Oh yeah, very much. Shade. Yes.
Time.
Either one.
I was just going to say the timelessness. I mean, they humble you.
Yeah.
You see a big tree and you think, yeah, that was probably about 1900.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Humbleness. I like that. Timelessness. I think about time a lot, so I like that one. Yes.
They're the lungs of the earth, which are, I appreciate them every time I breathe.
Right.
Not every time, all right. Often.
So we like the aesthetics and the qualities they provide to our world, whether it's fresh air or shade or wood products. I like wood products too. What feelings do they convey to you when you're with a tree? Yes.
Well, I feel they communicate to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I know they're communicating to each other.
Yeah.
Lots of times the roots underneath are talking to each other,
Yeah.
the trees together. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And also, they are such a shelter for the animals.
Mm.
The animals are very much in synchronization or beautiful
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah. Yes.
I try to garden in a yard surrounded by Norway maples,
Hmm.
and I curse them as I pull up hundreds of seedlings of the mother of thousands.
Right. Right. Yes. I have some trees that give me those feelings as well. But don't you often think about peace and stillness and quiet, like trees might be stoic? So
There's also the sway in the wind and
Right.
the rustle of leaves and the crunch of fallen leaves in the fall under your feet and twigs snapping. All that stuff.
but fairly gentle things. Seasonal associations. So when I started studying trees from a tree perspective, using their language, and when I mean their language, I mean the information that's available in each ring, not just how old the tree is, but how it's growing, how it's reacting to things. Those ideas of stillness and peacefulness and swaying with the breeze and those things, I still have that. But now I think of trees as really dynamic, almost moving in some ways. Of course, they don't move. And think about that for just a second. Can you imagine standing for centuries in one place? And when a storm comes, you can't go hide. When it gets cold, you just have to deal with it. When it gets hot, you have to deal with it. When a fire comes, you have to deal with it. Trees do that. Think about that. And so when those things happen to a tree, they internalize it. But it's not just an internalization. They do things to adapt to those conditions. They are active. And so when I think about trees, I think of them being actually active and dynamic. So the point of my book is to try to understand how we can understand the lives of trees beyond what you described, which is wonderful and good things, but about their dynamics and what they provide and how they live and how they grow for 300-400 years. Because I think understanding that will then help give us a better sense of hope for the future. Trees are amazingly resilient. If you think about them standing in one place for 400 or 500 years, they have to be. They can't just fall over with one storm or 2 storms or 10 storms. They have to take all those storms. And so that's going to be the point of my book. And ultimately, I want you to love trees as much as I do, but in very different ways. So last question, what do you want to learn or know about trees? What's something you're curious about? Yes?
I don't know how to phrase this. How can you tell a tree, how can you tell a tree, what type of tree? Like, how can you tell?
Well, generally by the shape of the leaves, by the type of seeds it produces, and when you get really familiar with individual species, you can start learning them through their bark. And that to me is one of the funnest parts about learning about trees. And it's not just the bark that that you see in the street tree. When they get 200 or 300 or 400 years old, their bark changes, but they have very identifiable patterns when they're 200 or 300 or 400 years old. So those are the best ways. Those are some of the easiest ways. But even sometimes you can look at the structure of the wood and you can say, oh, this is a maple, this is an oak, this is a pine. And then real professionals can get eyepieces out and go, oh, look at this structure of this wood, that's this species. So that's one way you would do it. Yes?
Where are the closest old growth trees?
You're not going to believe it. Wachusett Mountain. The oldest known red oaks ever, so far, are growing on Wachusett Mountain. So on the north slopes, in between the ski trails, there are 330, 340, 350-year-old red oaks.
Really?
Yeah, really. And it's amazing that it's been Boston's ski area for how long? I don't know how long. Years? Yeah, and the north, not all of it, but a lot of the north side of that mountain, just above the parking lot, is old growth. There isn't much left because, sheep were important 180 years ago, 200 years ago, and other things like food for people. But Wachusett. And that's the other thing I want to explain in this book, because people don't recognize what old trees look like. They think they're all big, and that's not the case. The big red oaks are this big. The oldest red oaks are this big. And so recognizing what they look like will help you appreciate the forest more, because how many hundreds, thousands of people have skied by these trees, hiked by these trees, and didn't know? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to learn more about beech trees. They're huge, and they have, they're fascinating to me. And are they from Europe, or are they here?
Some, the copper beeches, or the purple beech, I heard someone use a name for it, those are from Europe. Those are ornamentals. They grow very fast. They can be this big at about 100 years. They grow very fast. When you're planted in a park, you can grow very fast. But we have our own beech, the American beech. It's got a disease, a bark disease right now, but it's holding its own. I saw a hand over here. Yes?
What trees are resilient to drought? Or can you talk at all about that?
Sure.
Trees and drought and
Yeah.
droughts?
Yeah, that's actually one of my specialties.
Good.
So
Trees I'm worried about.
most trees are pretty resilient to drought. We don't know how resilient they are now because we haven't had a serious drought. And when I say a serious drought, I mean more than 1 year of drought for 50 years. The drought 2 years ago was bad, but it was just one season. And trees can handle that.
Right.
Hardly any trees died. The only trees that I saw that died from that drought were already diseased or injured.
Okay. But
So
do drought trees fall? Do they fall down?
eventually,
Yeah.
eventually they do.
Great.
But oaks, hickory, I think white pine is going to be pretty resilient to drought, and pine.
What about beech?
A beech, not as much. Not as much. But it also depends on where they're growing and where they're rooted. Gives them a lot of flexibility. Trees have ways of adapting, so when a bad drought comes, the theory is that they actually start dropping leaves. First they actually roll up their leaves so they don't lose as much water. So if you watch a tree during drought, they'll change the shape and the angle of their leaves to avoid the stress of the heat and the drought. But then they'll start dropping leaves early, which was what happened in 2016. And then if this goes on for a few years, they'll start dying back and they'll actually shrink in height. But that's a way of reducing the amount of living tissue that they have to maintain. So they will go through several stages before they die. Yeah?
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Those trees on Mount Wachusett, are they protected?
I think they are. I don't know what the official designation is, but I think now that people know that they're old growth and the people, the Department of Natural Resources knows what they have, yeah, they're protected in that sense. Hopefully there'll be no more ski trails going through. Yes, I'm sorry. How tall are they? They're not very tall. I don't know exactly. 60 feet, 70 feet, not very tall. And that's because most of the old growth we have today that escaped the axe are growing on sites that are not conducive to good growth. So most of our old growth are on sites with very little soil or south-facing slopes, which are hotter and drier. So they never got big enough that people thought about cutting them for timber, or the site isn't good enough to grow corn or wheat or anything like that. So most of our old growth trees in the Northeast are actually on poor sites. The trees don't get very big, but that doesn't mean they can't live for a long time. Yes?
How tall are the red oak trees in Massachusetts? How do you tell how old a tree is?
So that's, we do that through their growth rings. So you know, right, that each winter the trees don't have any leaves, right? And then in the spring they put on new leaves. And that dropping and growing of new leaves generally shuts down growth for the year. And so that shows up in the tree rings, and when you look at the rings, you can see structures that say this is the beginning of the growing season, and then the cells of the ring change, and that's the end of the growing season. And you just find those patterns of rings, and I don't want to say count them, because it's more complicated than that. Everyone goes, oh, you just count the rings. It's not that simple, actually. It's actually much more complicated than that. When there's a bad drought, sometimes the trees don't grow a ring on the trunk. And so you might count 110 rings, but that tree might be actually 112 years old, because maybe it didn't grow a ring for 2 years, or during 2 years. So it's a term we use called cross date. We date the rings. We put calendar dates on the rings, and you verify that pattern of rings through time, and then you can tell how many years it's been alive. Yes, ma'am. Oh, we have a nice little tool called an increment bore, and if you've seen people bore into a tree for maple syrup, for example, it's a very similar process, except for our bores are hollow tubes, and so we drill into the tree, and it cuts a piece of wood that is about the diameter of a chopstick, and we have a tool that helps us extract it, and then we put it on a little piece of wood and we sand it. So we only take samples that are about the diameter of a chopstick. And we make holes about the diameter of a tree, and then we sand them up very nicely, and we can count the rings.
How do you count the number of rings if you don't cut the tree down? Oh, I have another question. I've been noticing a lot of fir trees seem to be dry or dead. I don't know. Is that a disease, or is it something because of the weather?
There's a lot of things happening right now, unfortunately. Red pine was planted, by the CCC, and they planted it in sites that weren't really appropriate for it, and so there are some diseases hitting it, and they're suffering. They're kind of off-site. They're not in the right location. They're a little too far south. So that's one thing. But there's a new disease, unfortunately, that I don't think people fully understand yet. It's called complex needle decline disease, something like that. So if you go on Route 2, the white pines are looking brown, or they're dropping their needles. And it's not just white pine, but it's mostly white pine. And it's a new disease that's, I read an article about it, but they don't still have a whole handle on it. It's really complex. But they think that, I think it's dry Junes stimulate the disease on the trees. Do you know, have you noticed the gypsy moth defoliations that are happening?
Yes.
That hasn't happened severely since 1981, and part of that is related to climate. When we have wet Junes here, the gypsy moths are hatching, but a fungus comes up with the water, kills off the gypsy moth, and then trees don't get defoliated. We've had droughts in June lately, and the gypsy moth are building their populations. Yes, sir.
What's the effect of road salt on trees close by, and how far in from the side of the road does it typically go? Has that ever been measured?
I'm sure it has. I don't know all the literature to it. You know, the trees can handle lots of things, and if it's not too bad, they can handle it. I do know that the thruway in New York State, for example, salt marsh plants are now growing naturally in between the thruway because there's been so much salt dumped there. But some of the white pine along Route 2 and in the Adirondacks, if you notice, they look a little yellow early in the spring, and that's we call it chlorosis. Some of that is this salt spray that comes from the road. They're tolerating it right now. Luckily, we're living in one of the wettest periods of the last 500 years, so maybe that gets washed away a little bit, but I don't know. I'm not up on all that literature. Yes?
Norway maples.
Yeah?
Yeah. Maynard has many,
Yes.
as you know.
Mm.
A lot of them look absolutely terrible.
Mm.
Does it, as a foreign introduced tree, does it have sort of a lifespan that it's reaching the end of? I mean, there's so much dieback on
Yeah.
so many of them, or is that just related to conditions and not a span of...
I think it's related to the conditions they're growing in. I'm not sure that they're the best tree, especially in sidewalk pots. I don't think that's a good place for them. The best trees, the best trees actually that they plant along streets are ones that grow in wetlands, because roots need oxygen, and so they learn to do more with less oxygen when they grow in wetlands. And so you can take that restricted rooting space and take those trees and plant them alongside the streets, and they do all right. That's why American elm was planted all over the place. And that's one reason why silver maple is one of the replacements, because it generally grows in wetlands, not the wettest sites. I don't know Norway maple's natural habitat in Europe, but boy, looking at them on the streets, I don't think it's this.
No.
I don't think it's, even before the drought. Sorry, I have a curious little person right here. Yes, sir.
What did the oak trees look like back in the 1920s?
Back in the 1920s, what did the oak trees look like? Where? Which ones are you talking about? Do you mean the ones here in Maynard? They were probably a little bit smaller, not too much shorter, but they probably didn't look too dissimilar. Maybe they've gone from this to this now, if they are this big. Oh, yes, in the back.
Why if it's the same type of tree and in the fall, they grow different colors?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a tough one. You should get a degree in science, and you can study that. That's because I think that's an unanswered question. We still don't know exactly why trees turn certain colors more so in some years than others, why they're better colors. We have some ideas about that. It's still a topic of research, but I think a lot of it is the basically the compounds within the leaf that that different species use for various purposes that get revealed as the trees go into fall. So when trees turn color, it's not that in the fall, it's not that the leaves are turning color per se, it's that the chlorophyll is breaking down and getting conserved back into the tree. And so what you're seeing is a revealing of the colors that are there in the leaf, though I wouldn't be surprised if they sharpen up in color due to various factors. The reds and the oranges that you see, there's a working idea that those colors are like a sunscreen to protect the inside of the leaf. So like the sunscreen we use to protect ourselves from the sun, some people think that the red leaves we see in the fall, the red color that you see is one of those. That's maybe why they have some of those colors. Yes, ma'am.
How many types of trees are there?
How many types of trees are there? Woo! That's the hardest question of the entire night. Oh my gosh, good job. I don't know. I do know, I should know this. That's amazing. She trumped the expert. There are 300 species, more than 300 species in the eastern United States alone. In the Smoky Mountains, one of our best national parks in the eastern United States, there are more than 100. So thousands. And there are probably more species to be discovered. In fact, there was a new species discovered in Korea just last year, a hemlock. It'd always been there, but they finally realized it's a different species. So that's in temperate forests. So in tropical forests, there's probably tons of species that still need to be identified.
Dad.
Wait, last one.
Last
one. Go.
What happens when a tree gets struck by lightning?
What happens when a tree gets struck by lightning? Well, it depends on how severe it is and how healthy the tree is, but I've seen, and you've seen trees struck by lightning, right? You can identify them because there's a strip of bark that's been torn away from the tree, usually running down one axis of the tree. I was in a forest one time in South Carolina, and a big loblolly pine got struck by lightning while I was in the forest. And I found it the next day, and it had shed almost all its needles, and it died. But it's not the end of trees, typically. So I just want to say one more thing. Thank you. If you have any ideas about what you really learn, what you'd like me to write about in a book about the memories of trees, you can email me. You can find me online very easily. But I would also say, go out into a Maynard's forest, because they are actually very special. I've been very surprised at the species that are here in Maynard, and especially Summer Hill. If you're on the south side of Summer Hill, there's a conserved area there. It's like being in Virginia. When you go to the north side of that hill, it's like being in the Adirondacks almost. And we have that right here in Maynard. So Maynard's actually a special place for trees too. Thank you.